Horticultural lighting is something we need to consider if we live in a place where we have low daylight hours, perhaps in the northern states of America, Canada, in Europe and those kind of places. Right down in the south of Australia, perhaps, you might have very short winters where you need to consider horticultural lighting in order to extend the amount of light that the plants get in order to make them grow satisfactorily. So horticultural lighting is a very important subject to cover for people in those areas. And whether we need to do it or not depends on, first of all, where we're at, we've just covered that, and also what kind of light are we going to use for what kind of plants. There are basically two kinds of plants you've got to think about, two groups, and one is flowering, fruiting plants, and the other is leafy greens. And leafy greens don't require quite the same intensity of light as flowering and fruiting plants do, but when you're planning your system, you should consider putting in lighting that will cover fruiting plants, because if you cover the needs of the plants at a higher level, then your lower level plants will be quite well satisfied in the situation. So that's the first thing. Are they vegetative type plants or are they flowering plants? Your climate will depend on this, of course. You may need to think about your power source because these lights are going to burn a lot of power, and when you're doing your plan for the whole greenhouse and working out your load, your lighting load, you need to put a lot of time and effort into thinking about and adding up the number of watts you're going to burn when all the lights are on. How many hours per day are you going to need to run the lights? If you're going to build a system inside an old warehouse, for example, which seems to be a very popular idea, then you need to run the lights 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Or you'll have a daylight hour and you'll have close them off in an assumed darkness time. So you'll have to work out all those hours and do your budgeting accordingly. Also, you need to budget for the initial cost because these lights can be quite expensive. They really, really can. So there's really only 3 or 4 different types of lighting we can consider. The first one is high pressure sodium, or HPS they're generally referred to. Metal halide, which is MH. You've got T4, which is fluorescent lighting. And you've also got the new one on the block, and that's LED lighting. So there are 4 different kinds of lighting that you might need to investigate for your area. Of course, the ones that have been around for a long time are the first two, and that's metal halide and sodium lights. They've been around for a very, very long time, and there's a lot of good data you can get out there. I'm afraid to say the people who are the best experts at this are those that grow that leafy green substance that's not legal everywhere. Those kind of people have got a lot of experience in using this kind of lighting. So if you can get to one of those kind of people to really find out the really ins and outs and where to buy the best lighting from, that's your contact point, quite frankly. Now let's look firstly at high pressure sodium. It generally runs a light colour or temperature around 2,700 to 3,000 Kelvin, which is the orange-red range of the light spectrum. And that's primarily used for flowering plants and fruiting plants. So if you're going to be growing a lot of tomatoes, for example, under lights, or cucumbers, those kind of plants, then you should probably think about high pressure sodium lights. Metal halide lights, for example, they're generally better for fruiting plants than they are of leafy greens, but they also cover the range of leafy greens quite well. Lettuce and all those kind of things, spinaches and all that kind of thing. And they've got more light in the blue spectrum of light. And they run at about 6,000 to 6,500 Kelvin, which looks actually quite white to the naked eye, but they have a lot of blue spectrum in them. The other one, and the cheapest option for most people, is compact fluorescent lighting, or T4. You can buy the lighting tubes, which just look like a standard fluorescent tube that you might have fitted in your house. They're actually quite low cost to buy, actually, and they work quite well, particularly with leafy greens. They're effective for smaller plants. For example, where you don't need to get a lot of light penetration down through the plant, because a problem you can have when growing tomatoes, for example, and tall bushes is the lightest up here, and the light penetration doesn't get all the way down through. So you wouldn't want to use T4 for that, or your fluorescent tubes. They are really, really well suited to using on growing leafy greens like lettuce and spinach and all those kinds of things. They're very ideal for raising your seedlings. If you've got a seedling raising area that's inside a warehouse, and you might be in any part of the world actually, and you want to raise your seedlings indoors for protection, or you want to raise your seedlings before the springtime comes, you could do that indoors under T4 light tubes. Now, I've inquired on pricing on that here in Australia, and you can buy a 40 watt T4 tube for around about $15. So it's really quite cheap actually. Another good thing about them is they don't raise much heat, whereas your sodium and your metal halide lights, they generate a lot of heat, and that can be another problem inside the house or the growing area, wherever it is you're doing it. It could also be a good thing if it's cold outside, you're adding heat to the area. So with T4s, there's no heat much generated at all. Now let's talk about the last one, which is LED lighting. Now, my friend in Western Australia, who I've asked a lot of questions about this, he says that LED lighting is not quite there yet. It's getting very close, and I think for most people who are growing under lights, LED is what they're holding out the future for, because theoretically LEDs should be a lot less expensive to run, because LEDs burn a whole lot less power than those big metal halide lamps, for example. And of course they give off very little heat. They give off a little bit of heat, but not very much. So they're definitely a thing for the future. Now, why they think they're not quite there yet, I think it's to do with the light spectrum. It's probably not quite as good as it should be, so I'm told, but it must be very close, because I've seen a number of examples lately of clients of ours that have sent us photographs and pictures and updates of what they're doing under lighting, and they're almost all using LED lighting now, and most of them are reporting that they're getting pretty good results. When you use LED lighting, a lot of the photographs that I've been sent, and here's one of them here now that you can look at, you can actually see the light spectrum, quite distinct light spectrum that's being put on the plants. And yeah, it's a good thing. So it's reasonably new innovation in horticultural lighting, LED is. And the early ones that came out, when they first came out, they were very, very expensive to buy. And of course the reason for buying them was that the initial buy price was going to be expensive, but they were going to be cheap to run. And of course, as we've seen technology advance very rapidly in this area, the buy price is dropping quite quickly on the purchase of them. So I think it's reasonable to assume that from here on in, LED might be the best option that you can think about when you're considering horticultural lighting. So let's just summarise the benefits of LED lighting. I want to tell you what they are. Less power consumption. That's a biggie, because if you've got a big farm, you can burn an awful lot of power in a day. So they're great for leafy greens. Current LED technology works wonderfully with growing leafy greens. Much less heat generated in the area, and that's a good thing, because lights down close to your plants, if they're generating a lot of heat, can be a problem. So that's fixed with LED lights. And good quality LED lights are still expensive, and much more expensive to buy than the metal halide and those kind of lights. So just bear that in mind. So do your research very carefully. Don't necessarily go and buy the cheapest one you can find, because the light spectrum may not be as good as it should be. So make sure you do your homework on which LED lights you buy for your growing system.